In anticipation of Jewish Women's Aid Shabbat 2020, I would like to express my full support for all the efforts of Jewish Women's Aid to highlight the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on domestic violence within Jewish homes. We would like to presume that such illegal and shameful conduct is not a feature of life within our Jewish community. Sadly, however, that's not the reality. Prior to the pandemic, there was a lot of domestic abuse within Jewish homes. And during the pandemic, we have seen a tragic increase of this phenomenon. So in the event that you are affected by domestic abuse, or if you know someone who is affected by it, please don't hesitate to come forward to speak to Jewish Women's Aid, who will be pleased to provide confidential advice and support. God bless you all.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Sunday Night Live. We are once again sharing our broadcast this week with members of Whitefield Shul, Heaton Park Shul, Steen Court, and also Mead Hill Road. So a good evening to everybody who are regulars and people joining us for the first time. Like and share us. We're going to stick around during this pandemic and try and keep you all connected with some major issues. Before I introduce our guest this evening, we have to say a refuah shalema to our rabbi who this afternoon announced that he had been diagnosed with COVID. He's feeling okay. He's lost his sense of smell, but so far he's feeling good. So we wish him a refuah shalema and hope that he can join us back on the show next week. So thank you to everybody watching and thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight I am joined by Naomi Dickson from Jewish Women's Aid. You're the chief exec. Welcome, Naomi. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me on, David. Yes, doing well, fine, thank you. But it's tough times, isn't it?
I think it is, and we're going to find out how those tough times have affected everybody within the community, but also within your organization. So just give us a little bit of background as to how you came to be chief exec of Jewish Women's Aid and who you are for people that haven't met you before.
Okay, well, it's lovely to see everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. I grew up in Leeds, made my way down to London, and one of my first jobs was managing big housing estates in West London, Southall and Acton, and I always worked with hundreds and hundreds of tenants in housing, and some of the women always came to me and said that they were experiencing domestic abuse and how could I help them. So that's when I first kind of became interested in what domestic abuse looked like, how it affected women. And I do remember one woman saying to me, she phoned me and she said, I need to go now, otherwise he's going to kill me. And I was very privileged, I think, to be able to find her alternative housing and help her to move. And after that point, I started volunteering for Jewish Women's Aid. This must be about 20 years ago, and eventually started working for them, managing their refuge. And then eventually I moved on to their running all the communications and training programs. And I've been chief exec for coming up to 6.5 years now.
Wow. So I suppose I'm not allowed to ask you if you enjoy your work, but because it's an unfortunate subject to have to deal with. But when you're able to help these people, I'm sure you find it rewarding. Maybe that's a better word for it.
It certainly is a huge privilege. You know, Jewish Women's Aid is the only domestic abuse agency in the whole Jewish community. We're trusted, we're well respected, and being able to support women when they are reaching out to you for help at a point when their whole life has fallen apart, and being part of that process when they put it back together again and move on to a life that they hadn't planned but is actually free from fear and abuse is just a huge privilege, and it's an amazing thing to be part of.
Good evening, Sheila Morris. Good evening, everybody else that is that's watching and that's tuned in. So obviously, this weekend has been designated as Jewish Women's Aid weekend, where we talk about where rabbis and communities are encouraged to talk about domestic abuse and domestic violence within our communities. It's not something that is peculiar to our community. It's something that happens in every community across the world, probably. It's extremely prevalent. And sometimes we as Jews, we tend to think that we sort of hold that moral high ground sometimes due to the sort of code of ethics that we all aspire to. We assume sometimes mistakenly that this doesn't happen within our communities. And part of the work that you do is to spread that awareness and to get people to talk about it more openly. Why is that such a difficult conversation for us to have?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head, haven't you? I mean, I do think that, we just would love to think that domestic abuse is not an issue in our community, just like all the other evils that are around. We know that they're there. And the big challenge really is to break down that taboo, because the women who are experiencing domestic abuse feel an enormous burden of shame and humiliation and reluctance to seek help, because they feel that almost that they're letting the side down. And how can they tell their mum or their grandma who was at their wedding that this might be, characterized as a nice Jewish boy who, everybody loved and is busy in the community or has got a really good job? How can they tell them that actually he's been treating them like absolute rubbish for, years and years and years? And that's a really, really difficult thing to do. We know that nationally, women are staying in abusive relationships and living with perpetrators for 9.5 years. And actually, the work that we've done in Jewish Women's Aid, looking at our numbers, tells us that women in our community are staying for 11.5 years with an abuser, because of those issues around shame and humiliation and the embarrassment to seek support. And so really the whole point of the Jewish Women's Aid Shabbat is to encourage community leaders and rabbis and open conversations like this, and people to speak out and say, look, we know it's happening to you, just like the chief rabbi did before. We know it's happening to you. It's absolutely okay to pick up the phone and get help. You're not alone. And you can phone Jewish Women's Aid, who will understand you. They'll understand your community, your culture, your faith, your shul, everything. And please, please, please pick up the phone. And what we find after we do this Shabbat every year, and increasingly more and more people get involved with it, is that actually more people pick up the phone and say to us, actually, do you know what? It's not okay. Can you help me? And that's really why we do it, because talking about domestic abuse breaks down the taboos and gives women the permission to seek support.
And it's at its core, it's shame, isn't it? Sometimes that prevent women from coming forward and talking to somebody about the abuse that's happened at home, because it's so easy for people to say, well, look, if things are so bad, why don't you just pack your bags and leave? We all seem to, when we're advising other people as to what they do, their lives are far less complicated than ours, and they can just make it all go away. But in effect, there's so much that you and I were talking behind the scenes earlier about the housing side of things, in terms of the struggles that women might have to go through if they're leaving an abusive environment and they're looking to go somewhere safe. But there's a myriad of different issues that prevent people from moving on, not least their relationship with the abuser sometimes.
Absolutely. And I think, what we always try to remember when we talk to women is that the reasons that they got into that relationship in the first place, quite often the woman still says, but I love him and he still is telling me that he'll change. And every time he's abusive to me, there's an apology afterwards, and then a quiet period, and then an escalation in the abuse. So what we see is a cycle of abuse, but within that cycle, there are quiet periods and there are good times. And, if the abuse was sustained and non-stop, I think it would probably be a more straightforward decision about whether to seek help or not. But because it isn't, and because there is hope and love and quiet periods and children, it makes it really, really hard to seek help. And then, overlaying that, of course, an abuser is very likely to say to the victim, well, you know, you're worthless, nobody will ever take you. If you try to leave me, I'll kill you, you'll never see the children, you're not going to get any money. She may have been affected by lots of different types of abuse. You know, it's not just physical, we know that, it's emotional, it's psychological.
That's what people think about when we talk about domestic abuse. We think about people with black eyes and busted lips, but it's not as visible as that, is it?
Not at all. And of course, you know, we see the women with black eyes and busted lips, and that's awful to see. But also awful to see is women who have got no self-esteem left, and it has just been dripped away over an extended period of time, who've been stopped from getting jobs. They have been economically abused, and all their money has been signed away, and they've got no financial literacy because they've not been able to access it, or they've been sexually abused. And also, actually, in our community and in other faith communities, we see a lot of what we call spiritual abuse, which is the misuse of Jewish law and custom to control women. For example, you know, we worked with one woman years ago who said to us that when her whole family was gathered around the table on Friday night, she'd invited everyone for dinner. She'd been abused by her husband in private over 10 years. And the whole family was there, and he stood there and he went, I'm not singing Eshet Chayil to you because you're not worth it. Oof. And, you know, it's a horrible story, and it's a story that is true and that we understand at Jewish Women's Aid. But I think if a woman went to a mainstream service, she would have a really long job explaining that, which you need a specialist service that understands what women are going through, but also kind of, you know, serves to demonstrate that actually domestic abuse is not about black eyes, it's about power and control. And that's really what cuts through all of those different things.
Because in a sort of traditional Jewish family setting, and let's face it, most Jewish families, even today in sort of modern times, I think you've got a very traditional sort of family settings where the roles have kind of been set for years in terms of what daddy does and what mummy does, and what mummy doesn't do, and what daddy gets involved with and what daddy refuses to get involved with. And in general, what you hear a lot is that women don't get involved with the financial arrangements of the household, or controlling the flow of money at home. Because that's something my husband deals with, or it's something that seemed to be the sort of realm of the male in the household, which is in itself is outdated and archaic, but it happens, and it happens a lot. Now, when it's great, that's good that somebody else is looking after the finances and you don't have to worry about it. But if you then had to plan leaving home because unfortunately you need to, you wouldn't know the first thing about your finances, where the money comes from, how much of it you've got, and whether or not you've even got access to it. So I would imagine, is it fair to say that financial abuse or that economic abuse that you referred to is more prevalent within sort of the people that you see than the mainstream services?
I don't know that it is, actually. I mean, it certainly is very prevalent. It really is. I mean, we see an awful lot of it because it's a very subtle and almost easy way of controlling somebody. So you're just, you know, it starts off as kind of being helpful, and you know, perpetrator manages the finances and just kind of slowly takes control. And before she knows it, everything is in his name. But I don't know if I would say necessarily that we see more economic abuse in our community than elsewhere. What often strikes me is that when women come into our service, you know, it's not just one type of abuse, it's a whole load of them. So they'll quite often say, well, you know, I think what we do know is that women are really reluctant to say, hi, I'm being abused. They'll phone up and say something like, something's not right in my marriage, and my friend said I should call you. I don't think you're the right people for me, but And we do a whole piece of work with the women saying, look, actually, these are signs of abuse. If this is happening and this is happening, and you haven't got the power and control in your relationship to push back and say, actually, no, I'm not comfortable with this, then we will characterize that as abuse. And actually, more often than not, women will tick various boxes in the categories of economic abuse, but also emotional and physical, and sexual, and the whole range. Quite often, it is very rare that the abuse is segregated just to one area.
And it's not something that tends to just stop at the marriage and that intimate relationship between husband and wife. Sometimes it can overspill into relationships with children and so on. So, when abuse is present, it then has a knock-on effect on the kids as well.
Oh, completely. And particularly during COVID, even before COVID, we were working really hard offering therapy to lots of children who have witnessed domestic abuse at home. And that is an abuse in itself. Those children have been traumatized. And so a lot of the children's therapy that we do is helping them to build resilience, make sure they're not blaming themselves, making sure they've got the tools to build healthy relationships with their friends and, romantic relationships in the future. And actually during COVID, we've increased the number of children's therapy sessions by almost 2/3, because mums have been phoning us saying, look, we're stuck at home in lockdown. They're just seeing so much, or they've just kind of witnessed, even remotely, far too much abuse. And so the impact of lockdown on those children is absolutely immense. And of course, on the women that we work with, we're working with about 1/3 more women than we would normally. At this time of year. So when I started working at Jewish Women's Aid, we were working with about 400 women a year. This year, I think we're probably going to be hitting almost 800.
Wow.
Because it's just, we've had women phoning us and saying, look, I'm in the car, I can talk for 10 minutes, and then I've got to go home again. And obviously the biggest concern really, from where I sit, is the women who just, because of lockdown, can't access the support that they need. And that is just incredibly dangerous for them.
So let's talk about that. Let's focus on the effects of lockdown because there's a definite correlation. It's not just you guys that are reporting an increase in people reaching out for support, but we hear this across even the mainstream press as to how domestic abuse rates and domestic violence has gone through the roof, hospitalization cases and all sorts since the beginning of lockdown. Now, in simplistic terms, we can all assume that this is because an abuser and the person being and the victim are having to share and cohabitate without a break, and it's been round the clock for weeks, if not months, in some cases. But it's far more wide-reaching than that. It goes to people are not able to call other people to say, look, I'm struggling. I'm having, even mentally, I'm struggling, because they're afraid of somebody else overhearing that conversation. So maybe take us through some of the sort of struggles that women are experiencing in this situation and why it's been exacerbated, particularly by lockdown.
Okay, I mean, lockdown's been, there's no getting away from it. Lockdown's been really hard for all of us. And I certainly wouldn't say that lockdown has caused domestic abuse. But what I would say is that lockdown was a very well-intentioned measure, which has been misused by perpetrators. So women who were already experiencing domestic abuse, a lot of those women, it's got significantly worse. And, we'll all have seen the awful media reports at the beginning of lockdown of all of those murders of women. Very tragically, nationally, 2 women die per week because of domestic abuse. And there's just been a report released today, which is called the Femicide Census. And that comes out every year, and it reports on all the women who've died by domestic abuse. But at the beginning of lockdown, that number went through the roof, and it was really, really high. That doesn't mean that this was brand new abuse. We are, across our sector, we think that the abuse was already happening, but because women couldn't get out of the house and their abuser was quite often at home all day, maybe furloughed, maybe there were economic circumstances which exacerbated the abuse, maybe it was just kind of, you know, the tensions were rising. What we know is that domestic abuse across the whole country and, you know, across all the sectors and all the domestic abuse organisations shot through the roof. And we immediately in kind of March, April, May saw a massive increase in women just reaching out to us for support. But not only were they reaching out to us for support, they were also increasingly anxious, telling us that they were increasingly prone to being victims of physical abuse. And so what that meant was that the abuse was more dangerous. And so that made us really, really concerned. And then, you know, we had women who had COVID. So we had one client who had been abused for, I think, 20 years and finished up with COVID, went to hospital. And once she came home, she needed care and support. But actually, the perpetrator of abuse took advantage of her vulnerability and locked her in her bedroom and tampered with her food, gave her no access to the outside world. And when she eventually was able to phone us, she needed emergency accommodation ASAP because actually her life was in danger. And while she was experiencing abuse before COVID started, certainly it had not escalated to that point, and that was because that was a COVID-related escalation. And we've seen lots of that in lots and lots of different ways, and that's really, really concerning for us.
It must be. So COVID obviously has its challenges in terms of both how people can access your services, but it has challenges inherent for the service providers themselves. So a lot of organizations have had to, the word that everybody's using, the buzzword is pivot. We're having to sort of change and adapt. But tell us a little bit of how JWA have had to change their services and perhaps the way that people can access them in order to keep supporting the right sort of people through lockdown.
Well, I mean, you're quite right. I mean, I think pivot sounds very graceful, doesn't it? And I don't think it felt particularly graceful at the beginning of lockdown.
Pirouette, yeah.
And that's how we did it. We pirouetted our way through the first few weeks of lockdown. What we did was we took all of our clients online. So that means that the way we're structured is that we've got a helpline and we've got a counselling team and we've got a frontline casework team who provide advocacy and support around housing and legal things and legal measures and welfare benefits and just kind of practical hand holding of kind of, look, you're here now, we're going to do risk assessments and support plans and help you get to wherever you need to get to. All of that we moved online. And in fact, at the beginning of lockdown, we owned one laptop, which is the one I'm looking at now. And what I did was a huge amount of fundraising. The community, the sector and the government were generous, and we were able to give all of our staff mechanisms to support women remotely, which was amazing and incredibly helpful. Our children's therapy also went online, and each child that we worked with was sent a pack of toys that they could do play therapy with on the screen. We also set up our web chat service, which means that somebody can click on our website and type in to a chat box and talk to a caseworker at the other end of it, meaning that women who needed our help didn't need to pick up the phone and actually have a conversation that could be overheard. They could just tap something into their phone when they were going for a walk.
And that's a live service. So the minute
live service. So I've got caseworkers working on that, and they're highly trained. And what that means is that exactly. So at the end of that, there's a person saying, okay, all right, are you safe? What do you need to do? And we can do the risk assessments kind of in real time, but through the website. And then the other part of what we've had to do really is just make sure the staff are okay, because actually when you're sitting in your front room, looking at a screen, listening to trauma and listening to a woman's story, which can be absolutely heart-wrenching, part of my responsibility has been to make sure that we have the mechanisms and the supervision and support in place for the staff so that they were able to shake that off at the end of the day, replenish themselves and be back at their desk the next morning feeling sane. So actually, I mean, it really was a pivot, and we did a huge amount of work. And on top of that, of course, our casework numbers went up by approximately a third plus. So we're working with more women than ever before. And the last thing that we put into place, which I really wouldn't have expected, but I suppose makes sense now, is that we were seeing levels of destitution that I have never seen, having worked in the sector for 20 years. We've always had women who've said, well, actually, I can't afford to put down a down payment on my rent, or actually the next few months is going to be a bit of a struggle. But the number of women who were saying to us, I can't afford to feed my kids, or my fridge is broken and I just can't replace it, or I can't pay my utility bill, or I don't have petrol money to drive myself to the refuge.
Yeah,
really just shocked me immensely. And we've given out about 50 grants totaling over £20,000 since March. A lot of them were for day-to-day expenses, and also a lot of them were for children who didn't have any technical or technological equipment to help them with schoolwork. And so we had mums saying to us, look, I've got 4 children here and 1 laptop. I just can't do this. And actually those children were just totally disconnected from their school. They were falling behind. And so we found some grants, some more, did a lot of fundraising, and were able to supply quite a lot of laptops and Chromebooks and everything that those children needed in order just to connect back, not only with school, but to socialise with their friends. And that was partly because we were seeing that people had lost their jobs and were furloughed. Also, we were seeing delays in court processes, so child maintenance arrangements were delayed. So mums weren't getting the money they were entitled to. And also welfare benefits and universal credit payments also got delayed. And so there were lots and lots of different reasons. But actually, that was one of the biggest changes that we've seen. And that's not going away at the moment. We still need to make sure that we've got the money in place to support those women.
And I suppose as time ticks on and we find out the longer term economic aspects of COVID and the effects that it has on an average family, I think that pressure is going to put more strain on relationships. And certainly we talked about traditional structures within a family relationship. It's going to put tremendous strain on both men and women, but principally anybody that was seen as the main breadwinner, if they stop being that, then very often that then ends up with all sorts of anxieties and problems that are going to play out within the domestic environment. It's just clear. You touched on fundraising there. So we started out tonight by listening to the Chief Rabbi had very kindly put together that very short intro there, where he's absolutely unequivocal about his support for Jewish Women's Aid and about how wrong any kind of domestic abuse is. But let's not make light of it. It takes a long time to get to that stage where we can stand up as a community and have a major figurehead like that stand up and say, this is not right, this is happening, and it's not right. It was happening before lockdown, it's going to continue after lockdown, unfortunately, and we need to have more conversations about it. So obviously, that's testament to the great amount of sort of lobbying and educational work that you've done over the years to educate not just people who might want to access your service, but generally people who are in positions of perhaps power or influence in our communities, Rabbonim, who have the ability to open that conversation at their pulpit with their congregants. That's not an easy thing to change, because sometimes, let's call it what it is. It's far easier to sweep our problems underneath the carpet and to say, well, look, this is all okay. We're generally doing all right as a community. Please don't bring these horrible, ugly subjects up. So there's a great deal of work that's gone into that.
Yeah, absolutely. There really is so much work, and I'm very lucky. I've got a wonderful team of women around me and fantastic trustees who help with that. There was a point at Jewish Women's Day when I was running training programs, and it just became really clear that actually, if we wanted the women who need us to find us, then not only did we need to train as many professionals in the community as possible and also reach school pupils through programs and university students through programs, we needed to talk to the leaders. And actually, what women were telling us was that it was a very mixed picture. So that when we had, when women went to see their rabbi, which a lot of women do because they kind of want to understand, you know, how to take the next steps of their life in a kind of Jewish framework. Some rabbis were marvelous and amazing and incredibly supportive and would say to women, well, you know, that's not a Jewish marriage, you must move on. But some rabbis really didn't have the tools to be able to support women well. And what that meant was that then women were kind of feeling that they shouldn't really seek support because they shouldn't really be breaking up their marriage. And they were living then with more years of abuse. And that's obviously incredibly dangerous and is very, very damaging for children. So we have done a huge amount of support, sort of work with rabbis across the breadth of the spectrum, actually. So across the whole community, if you look on our social media, on our Facebook page this week, you'll see there's little films from rabbis, Liberal, Reform, Masorti, United Synagogue, Spanish and Portuguese, the chief rabbi, all saying
every flavor.
Sorry?
Every flavor.
Every flavor, all saying the same thing, which is we know domestic abuse is happening. It shouldn't be, but Jewish Women's Aid is here to help. Please call them. And actually, that's probably about 10 years work, kind of getting to this point. I mean, we have had huge amount of support across the way, and the chief rabbis very generously offered to be our patron, which is an amazing thing. But it's that kind of relationship building with rabbis, and explaining to them what we do. We're not a threat. We're here to support women. We're not here to kind of upset the balance of any marriages that are working well. But at the same time, if a marriage isn't working well and it has become abusive, actually, we're here to pick up the pieces. And what I often say to the rabbis is, look, you know, if you refer the women into our service, we will support her. You don't need to do that job, because rabbis have told me that it's just really difficult when they know that there's a kind of any form of marriage breakdown, and they go to shul that week, and the whole community is watching them. Now, is he going to talk to the woman? Is he going to talk to the man? You know, it becomes really difficult for rabbis. And so what we always say to them is, if you refer those women into our service, we will look after them. You know, as long as they've got your blessing to come into the service, we'll do our job. And that's one thing you don't need to do. But it is important to be able to identify the signs of abuse, to be able to say to a woman, look, do you feel safe? Are you okay? And then to say, actually, you know, why don't you pick up the phone to Jewish Women's Aid? They'll be able to help you. And
so with it being a slightly more difficult conversation and perhaps an uglier subject than we'd like to we like to think of it in that way. I mean, I'll tell you, but you know, obviously we've always supported Jewish Women's Aid at our shul, and particularly these sort of weekends where we have to raise awareness and that sort of thing. It's important. But when you say to somebody, okay, you know, on Sunday night we're going to be asking some questions about domestic abuse, yeah, you know, a lot of people will tell you, yes, that's a very important conversation we've got to have. A lot of people wince and they say, you know, oh, it's not exactly sort of easy listening or easy watching, but that's not necessarily what we're here to do tonight. But there's a challenge associated with that, because it's not a pleasant subject necessarily, and because it's something that we would rather sometimes ignore. Does that have an impact on fundraising? Because it's not the sort of jolly thing that you can invite everybody to a gala dinner for once a year, slap each other on the back and go, wow, we're wonderful. It must have an effect in terms of, you know, when you're raising money for the funds that you are having to allocate in an emergency circumstance. It must be tough to raise that money. It must be that much tougher.
It is hard. It's a hard ask because, you know, unlike some other causes where, you know, for example, we all know somebody who's aged, we all know somebody who's had dementia or, God forbid, cancer, you know, and that's kind of out there and it's not anybody's fault. I think domestic abuse is complicated to explain to people because of that initial taboo that we talked about of like, no, does it really happen in our community? And so quite often when I'm fundraising, I have to start at the very beginning of saying, look, it does happen in our community. These are the numbers. Like in the last 6 months, we work with 550 women. That's absolutely unacceptable that it's happening on such a scale. This is what we need to do in order to be able to help. Please, can you help us? So it's a longer story, and there is still a taboo that we're breaking down. I think it's the taboo's less than it was, but it certainly is still there, and that makes fundraising difficult. Again, when we have events, we have to manage them carefully, because it can't be some kind of circus jolly thing. We've got to be able to kind of balance our message, which is this awful things happening, with kind of all the normal things around kind of giving people a good time if they come to an event. So we have had an annual dinner. We had to sadly cancel one because of COVID, which a lot of other charities had to do as well. And that was really awful. And that's why we've put together an event which is screening this coming Thursday, to do with our campaign, which we've called A Mask Won't Protect Her. It's like a little 45-minute TV show with Emma Barnett and the new Domestic Abuse Commissioner, and Norina Hertz, who is an author and economist and philosopher, all talking about the impact of domestic abuse and COVID. It's difficult. Fundraising is always a hard thing to do, isn't it? Particularly in this community when people are really generous, but there's a lot of good causes. But I know that actually our numbers are higher than ever before, and are likely to carry on being very, very high for the next year or so.
And I'm presuming because of confidentiality, and that is something that you guys maintain above all else, and the identity of the victims, and the fact that they don't want anybody to find out, and it's not something that anybody wants publicized, it makes it that much more difficult to... You can't stand up and go, look at this. This is one of our success stories. So a lot of your work goes unregistered, almost in the public domain. It's something that happens behind closed doors, and thank God for that, because it would put people's lives at risk if it was out in the open.
Well, I think people's lives are at risk behind closed doors, really, and that's a dangerous place to be if you've got if you're experiencing domestic abuse. It can't be, we know the end game. We know that 2 women are murdered a week, and our community is sadly not immune. But because our confidentiality across the sector, and particularly in our organisation, because we're a community organisation, has to be absolutely watertight. You're right. I can't say to a woman, stand up and speak and tell everybody what your journey. At the same time, we have got fundraising tools and films that we have managed to use to tell the story of how we support women. And opportunities like this are invaluable, because actually what that means is that I can say, there are women in our service, like all of us, like your mum, like your sister, like your auntie, who you just wouldn't believe what they've been experiencing and what they've been subjected to. And they need help.
Yep. We've got some questions coming in, which I'm going to try and address. So good evening to Laura Greenberg. Laura asks, are you in touch with rabbis of all Hasidic communities? So I guess to pad that out a little bit more, you spoke about your work with sort of liberal communities, Masorti, United Synagogue. So that covers the left all the way to the middle. So as we edge to the right, how much more are you able to communicate with them?
It's a very good question, Laura. Well, that's a very, it's an interesting one. So I would say that actually kind of to the right, it's quite patchy. We've been very much in touch with the Federation of Synagogues, which is to the right of the United Synagogue, and they've been really supportive, and asked how they can help and support us. In terms of kind of Stamford Hill and the Haredi and Hasidic communities of Manchester and London, it's a bit hit and miss, because I think there still is a taboo. There still is a kind of hope, I think, that domestic abuse and all evils like that can be dealt with by homegrown agencies. And we know that's not the case, because actually I know that the women who are coming into our service are from those communities. They're equally represented. So we've got a Hasidic and Satmar and Haredi women coming into our service. But what is harder for us is making sure that our our literature and our messaging is in those communities, partly because those women, you know, find it harder to access a smartphone, or they, you know, the schools are less likely to stick a poster up, or the won't put a poster up. It is harder, but actually what we found is that word of mouth plays a much bigger part in those communities than it does in kind of the left middle parts of the community. The women do come to us, but you know, I always worry that they're coming later than they should be. And actually, you know, if the rabbis were able to stand up in shul and say, look, we know this is happening, pick up the phone, then we'd have more women who were experiencing less abuse before they seek help.
Sub question. There are, because I'm just thinking about you're right, there's a technological challenge to get over in terms of reaching and accessing the people in those communities for obvious reasons. But there are these sort of door-to-door publications. I know you guys have them in London. We certainly have them here. We used to refer to them affectionately as the Hamish Advertiser, but they have all sorts of different, all sorts of different names, and those go door-to-door on a Sunday, on a Wednesday, whenever it is. You get a copy of it. It's full of adverts and full of different stuff, some of it in English, some of it in Yiddish, if we don't want other people to be reading it, and all that sort of stuff. Are you prevented from advertising there? Have you tried to sort of reach people through that medium, or does it fall on deaf ears?
We have advertised in those actually with quite a lot of success. You know, it's the kind of thing that we don't do it every week, but we certainly have put adverts in there, and that's been absolutely fine. Some of the other publications have been a little bit more complicated, but actually those Hamish Advertisers, which we do enjoy down here as well, certainly we've been able to put adverts in, and that's really important because, you know, if you can get something printed through somebody's front door, then that's an amazing thing, isn't it?
Fantastic. Okay, Sharon Hood. Good evening, Sharon. Nice to hear from you as always. Can Naomi please explain about coercive abuse? It's not such an obvious one.
Absolutely, yes. Another excellent question. So in 2015, coercive control was made illegal, and coercive control is a pattern of controlling behaviour, which is used to control and overpower a victim of domestic abuse over a sustained period of time. So it might not be physical abuse, it might not be sexual abuse, it might not be anything that is kind of easy to identify, but one of the main identifying features is the pattern and the kind of ongoing and tightening stranglehold that the abusive perpetrator would have over the victim. It's quite difficult to evidence, and there haven't been that many coercive control convictions. But interestingly, actually, over the last few months, there have been a couple of threats of coercive control going to court and threats of private prosecutions, which have resulted in a get for a woman who was a chained woman who was an agona, because the legal team supporting those women felt that actually the ongoing coercive control and lack of willingness to give a get to those women constituted coercive control. And so just the threat of taking them for those men to a private prosecution resulted in 2 gets coming through, which actually was, you know, very, very late for a couple of those women. I think one of them had been waiting for her get for 9.5 years, and I'm not quite sure how long the other one had been waiting for, but that they were kind of really interesting and amazing, actually, examples of how that coercive control legislation can be used to support Jewish women. You know, and for the kind of not particularly Jewish cases, what we would always say to women is, if you think you're experiencing coercive control, and we would talk to them about what that might look like, we'd say keep a diary, try to keep down incidents in a safe way.
So just for those of us who perhaps are still struggling to sort of realize what it is, could you give us a few examples of what that might look like?
Let me just have a think. Well, you just put me on the spot. My mind's completely blank. I've got so many examples in my mind. But I would say it's kind of, you know, it's tied up with all the other types of abuse, really, coercive control. So it's not kind of necessarily, it wouldn't be physical, it wouldn't be sexual abuse, but it might be kind of stopping a woman from going out on a series of different occasions, removing her keys from her, controlling the amount of money that she's spending, making sure she's accounting for every single penny, making sure that, you know, controlling what she wears, the colour of her hair dye, and each incident is actually not particularly remarkable on its own, but what it means is actually the net is closing in on her on a day-to-day basis, and she is less and less able to make decisions for herself. Her control of her own life is disappearing very rapidly. She's not able to access money. She's going to be tracked when she goes to school. There might be a whole series of technical or technological abusive measures which are being used in conjunction with that, like all those the wonderful things that we have which allow us to show our family where we are on our phone, sure that we can see who's coming in and
devices,
all this used to control women in a very, very unpleasant way, and it's a whole pattern of abuse that would mean that actually she feels that she's got no control over her life, and it is slowly tightening that net to a point that actually, at the very beginning, women often say to me, well, there were signs, when he started saying to me, oh, I don't really like you in that skirt, or your hair looks better that way. But actually, over time, they became tools of abuse, as in, why are you wearing that? You look absolutely disgusting. And, women's self-esteem drips away. And, if you're told every day that you're stupid and ugly for 20 years, you start to believe it. And so the wherewithal of a woman to seek support is massively diminished. And that, plus the escalating abuse, means that it's actually very difficult to reach out for support. And so the coercive control legislation has been a really helpful tool, but, underused so far because it's harder to evidence.
Well explained, by the way. I know we put you on the spot, but we got it in the end. Okay, Elaine and Richard, good evening. A general question to you. How do you remain sane in the face of this onslaught? And do you ever have men who are in this position?
Well, there's two good questions. I'll take them one at a time. So how do I remain sane? Well, I'm very lucky. I've got a wonderful team of women around me who are all fantastic at their job. We support each other. There's a lot of camaraderie, and there's also, and very, very importantly, a lot of external supervision that we all have. Going to talk to external supervisors, clinical supervisors, where we can just download and make sure that actually we are sane in order to go back to our homes at the end of the day. And we make sure that everybody's line managed and supervised as well as possible. Doesn't mean that it's easy, but it does mean that the mechanisms are in place, that everybody gets supported. In terms of men in this position, yes, of course, men are affected by domestic abuse. In all the years I've been working at Jewish Women's Aid, we haven't had that many calls from men. I have made offers over the years and said, look, if you want to set up a Jewish Men's Aid, I would support you to do that and provide you with everything that you needed. But nobody's taken me up on that offer. But there are certainly some excellent agencies that we have referred men to who are abused, who are able to support them incredibly well, and we work well with them.
Now, a whole sort of controversial sort of sidearm to that question is obviously when we bring men into the picture, yes, there are men who are victims of domestic abuse, but they're also perpetrators as well. And I say this is controversial because it can be hard to get your head around why there will be organizations that support perpetrators, but there are such a thing as perpetrator organizations out there that provide support to perpetrators, and it's something that some people just can't make any sense of.
Well, there's a couple of really good ones. Respect is one that we work with quite closely, and Respect provides programs for perpetrators to help them to understand what they're doing and the impact of it. And so it tends to be, either one-to-one work or a course with other men. And actually, the numbers that go to those courses are not incredibly high, but they're growing because they've just done a huge piece of work with government to make sure that men are able to access those programs if they can. And I suppose what that provides people with is hope that actually it's not kind of like once a perpetrator, always a perpetrator. People can change their behavior, and that's definitely something to aspire to.
Very often those sort of organizations are vying for the same sort of funding pot as victims organizations as well. So it it has not always been a pleasant conversation to have, I should imagine. But yeah, it's probably vital that these organizations exist. We've got some other. This is a fantastic suggestion. I'm going to pop this up on the screen from SD Brooke. Good evening, SD. Have you ever explored working with the women's mikvahs to provide information and advice, and also an opportunity for a woman to call you from the privacy of the mikvah? The time that the woman spends in her own room, there is no threat of anyone seeing her reading the info or picking up the phone. So, are you recruiting mikvah ladies?
It's a very good question, SD, and it is a piece of work that we've done actually over the years, on and off, probably not as consistently as I would have liked. But the aim really is to make sure that there is at least a Jewish Women's Aid poster up in every room in the mikveh, so that women can read it, take down a phone number, make a phone call. And also we have trained some mikveh ladies over time, so that they're better able to identify the signs of domestic abuse and to support women who say, you know, who I'm scared of going home, or, you know, I've been putting off coming to the mikveh for a long time, or even women who've got, you know, obvious bruising. And that's a piece of work that is ongoing. But Esty, if you know anybody who would benefit from that training, then please definitely get in touch with the office, because it would be really nice to be able to reach more women who are working in the mikvahs.
Thank you for that, Esty. Right, Phil Cohen has asked, is there a refuge for Jewish women?
There used to be a refuge for Jewish women. We don't have one at the moment, and we don't have one at the moment because what we found was that funding a Jewish refuge in one place was becoming quite difficult for a lot of women who, you know, it's almost impossible to find a geographical location which is safe for all Jewish women to access. Because, you know, a lot of the women were telling us that they wanted to have a refuge in a Jewish area, which was fine. But then inevitably that Jewish area was unsafe for some of the women because that's where their perpetrator or perpetrator's family lived. So at the moment, we don't have a refuge. But what we do have is a flexible access to other refuges across the country. And we work really closely with other women's aids and other refuge providers. So that means that if a woman says to us, if a woman needs emergency accommodation, we can pick up the phone to a refuge in a particular area and say, actually, there's a woman who comes from this area. She needs to move out of the area very, very quickly. Have you got a space? And that's been a model that's been very, very successful for us, mainly because it's so incredibly flexible. And we can accommodate the needs of every single woman who needs emergency accommodation in that way.
And that's one of the challenges that goes hand in hand with a refuge. It's probably more particular to a sort of a faith community or ethnic community, because we tend to find that we have a hub in terms of where our lives are situated. So you want to be close to school, or you want to be close to a shul. That's where you live. That's where you work. That's where you shop. And I suppose when you're seeking refuge, yes, you're trying to get out of an abusive environment, but at the same time, you don't want your kids to suffer. You don't want everything else to suffer. And so there is that. We're programmed, aren't we, like homing pigeons, to go back to the core of the community. But it's very hard to keep secrets in a community, and it's very hard to keep a secret location. Very quickly that would start to get out, and if that gets out to perpetrators, then it causes a whole load of trouble. I should imagine that's a principal challenge that you've got with these sort of things.
Absolutely. And you see, I mean, I used to run the Jewish Women's Aid Refuge many years ago, and I will never forget the terror on the faces of the women who lived there when a perpetrator turned up and banged on that door. And it's, you know, a refuge is meant to be a safe space where women can heal and process and plan to move on with their lives. And one woman's perpetrator turning up and banging on that door just threw everybody in such a way that it was incredibly unsettling, not only for the women, but for the children. It was very triggering. There were lots of kind of women who'd experienced violence and shouting. And actually, you know, immediately at that point, the woman who'd been found, we had to move her on immediately to a different refuge so that she was safe, and also so the other women who lived in that refuge were safe. And that's an issue that all people who provide refuge space have. But you're right, you know, our community is kind of geographically centered in lots of different places. But actually, if somebody's got children in a Jewish school, they'll want to keep them in a Jewish school quite often. And a lot of the work that we do is kind of helping women to kind of move her whole life to a different part of the Jewish community, but where she can still access the services and the infrastructure that she needs.
Very important. Good evening, Michael Lurie. How do you overcome the potential challenge used by some to not connect for fear of the children going into care within a non-Jewish setting? So I guess Michael's referring to that as being a very common threat that a husband may use, or perhaps more ignorant people who are advising a victim may use. Say, look, keep this quiet, because the end result of this is they'll take away your kids, and your kids are not going to end up, in the environment that you wish. Let's face it, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to get to that, but there's a lot that needs to happen before that happens, right?
Absolutely. And I think the kids will be taken away threat is one that is used quite commonly by perpetrators. But in the years that I've been at Jewish Women's Aid, yes, it has happened, but not very often. I think, quite often we see mums who are really, really desperate to parent well and to look after their children well. And with the support that we give them, in conjunction often with social services, children being taken away can be avoided. And quite often the biggest threat to the children's safety is the perpetrator and the ongoing abuse. And actually, once the woman has picked up the phone to us and has started working with us, then we can help to minimise that threat and help the woman to reduce her level of risk and to increase her and her children's level of safety.
Also important. Right, Phil Cohen again. Hi, Phil. As a social worker myself, I'm wondering how aware are social workers of your work, particularly those in non-Jewish social care organizations? So I guess the wider question to this, Phil, is what part of your work at Jewish Women's Aid is spent translating it for other organizations outside of our community? And how many bridges do you need to build in order to ensure that there is that kind of sort of connected harmony there between services?
Well, that is one of the main pieces of work that our caseworkers do. And I've got 7 caseworkers who are all absolutely brilliant at not only supporting the women on a one-to-one basis, but also just helping them to navigate their way through social care systems and to work, in conjunction with the social workers, with the mental health teams, with healthcare professionals. When cases are high risk and when women come to us and we're concerned about their welfare, we would refer them in to social work teams and make safeguarding referrals if we needed to. And we also sit on various multi-agency risk assessment conferences just to make sure that actually all the professionals across the breadth of all the social services and others are there and understand what's going on for that woman. So, the high risk cases will sit in a room with police and probation and education and health and welfare and us, just to make sure that actually that woman is getting a coordinated approach across the breadth of the whole community, so that everybody who needs to be able to support her and her children knows about it. And so we do a lot of work with social work teams. And the caseworkers themselves quite often go into social work team meetings and talk to them about Jewish Women's Aid and what we do and how to work with us.
Okay, so we're coming up on about an hour now, so we're going to let you go soon, I promise. But just before we do, I think we could give you some a little bit of the nice accolades that you're getting here. So Arena Bell's written in, JWA do amazing work, which is much needed within the community. You've got Shari. Hi, good evening, Shari. So happy to be a part of JWA. So, the people that are working for your organization, they feel like they're doing something that is vital, no doubt. And Sharon Hood, thank God you were there for those that need it. So, it's and Phil then ends off by saying, sounds like excellent work. So I can only echo that. Naomi, I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody that's been watching tonight. Thank you for all the work that you and your organization are doing in general, but also thank you for taking time out tonight to speak to us about the work that you're doing and to raise awareness as much as you are, and to change perhaps the tone of the conversation and the frequency of these conversations as well, to enable us as a community to be able to speak more openly about it without fear of stigma or shame. So it's really, really valued, and thank you very much for coming on tonight.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me, David. It's been lovely.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure. So with no further ado, I'm going to let you all go. You're all dismissed. Thank you for joining us. Join us again next week when we will be covering another vital subject. But from all of us here at Shrubbery Shul and Sunday Night Live, have a good week. Thank you very much, Naomi.
Bye-bye. Thank you.